Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something quietly intense. A world of creaking timbers, dim lantern light, strict discipline, and the endless breath of the sea. We're diving into how an 18th century sailing warship truly worked, focusing on HMS Victory, a floating wooden city where hundreds of men lived, labored, and survived side by side. Forget the romantic ocean voyages you've seen in movies. The real experience aboard these ships was cramped, damp, exhausting, and more fascinating than you might expect. Most of us wouldn't last a single day in the routines that kept a warship alive. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing this little community of night owls and history lovers gathering from all over the world. Now then, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a small fan for that soft background hum of the ocean breeze. And let's ease our way into tonight's slow journey through the heart of an 18th century warship. The daily machinery of an 18th century warship. You find yourself standing on the gently creaking deck of an 18th century British warship, surrounded by the muted sounds of rigging straining against the wind. This is HMS Victory, perhaps the most famous ship of the age of sail, though today you are not here to witness the thunder of cannons or the heroic drama often associated with naval legends. Instead, you are here to learn how the ship actually worked, how it breathed, moved, lived, and functioned on an ordinary day. Victory was, in many ways, less a symbol of warfare and more a floating village, one built upon the quiet rhythms of wood, rope, canvas, and human labor. Understanding this ship means understanding hundreds of small, practical details that made survival at sea possible. To begin, you must picture the ship not as a sleek machine of war, but as a vast wooden ecosystem. Victory stretched about 227 feet from bow to stern and carried around 850 men. For a moment, imagine the daily life of those hundreds of individuals compressed into a carefully arranged structure of decks, beams, cabins, storage rooms, and tiny slivers of space carved out for sleep and work. Every detail of the ship had a purpose. Every piece of equipment had a designated place. And every task, from pumping the bilge to scraping the deck, was done with a steady familiarity, repeated again and again. The ship itself was built from roughly 6,000 trees, predominantly oak. The wood was selected years in advance, sometimes decades, so that the natural curves of the tree could be matched to the needed shape of ribs, knees, and beams. The grain of the timber mattered. Oak that grew slowly on poor soil produced tight rings and stronger planks. Even the specific angle at which a branch grew from the trunk determined whether it could serve as a knee brace in the ship's hull. The boring details of wood selection, so easily overlooked, were in fact the foundation of the ship's long-term survival. You might imagine the deck as one wide open surface, but Victory was built in layers, each deck with a specific purpose. The topmost weather deck was open to the wind and sky. It held the ship's wheel, the capstan used for hauling heavy anchor chains, and much of the exposed rigging. Below it lay the quarterdeck and forecastle, spaces reserved for officers. Below those came the gun decks, the upper, middle, and lower, where rows of cannons waited silently in peacetime. At the very bottom lay the orlop deck and hold, where stores were kept and the ship's financial records and medical spaces were tucked away in dim, lantern-lit corners. One of the defining features of Victory, like all ships of its class, was its internal rigidity. The hull and decks had to withstand not just the force of cannon fire, but the ceaseless stress of waves and wind. Every beam and plank had to work with every other, creating a structure that flexed but did not break. The ship was not a rigid block. It moved with the sea in ways you could feel beneath your feet. Even when anchored, the slow, rhythmic shifting of wood was part of the ship's constant background hum. Standing on the weather deck in calm seas, you might look upward and find yourself staring at an intricate forest of masts, yards, and rigging. The main mast rose nearly 220 feet above the waterline. These towering structures supported Victory's vast canvas sails, which, in full spread, could catch enough wind to propel the 3,500-ton vessel across the ocean. Yet the sails were not fixed objects. They had to be continually adjusted, furled, reefed, trimmed, or loosed, depending on the weather and the desires of the officer on watch. Rope work dominated much of the ship's structure. Victory carried over 26 miles of rope. Standing rigging held the masts upright, while running rigging controlled the sails. Blocks, pulleys, and belaying pins formed the basic technology that allowed sailors to harness the wind. The system was, in many ways, a mechanical masterpiece, complex, interdependent, and surprisingly efficient. Operate a single sail required teamwork and near-perfect coordination. Sailors climbed the shrouds and ratlins, sometimes in storms, sometimes in complete darkness, trusting in familiarity and muscle memory more than vision. Below deck, the air was dense with smells: tar, timber, rope, gunpowder residue, sweat, and dampness. Light came from candles or oil lamps, placed carefully so as not to ignite the volatile materials around them. Navy regulations even required lanterns to be enclosed in wire cages to prevent open flames. In these confined spaces, men ate, slept, and worked in conditions that modern readers might consider stifling. Hammocks hung side by side, only inches apart, providing barely enough room for a sailor to climb in. On a full ship, the space between rows of hammocks could be so tight that moving around required careful coordination, especially in the dark. Victory's complement included Marines, carpenters, sailmakers, cooks, servants, and officers, each group with its own daily roles. The Marines, for example, were soldiers who maintained order, guarded the captain, and manned the fighting tops during battle. Carpenters repaired the constant minor damage from the sea. Sailmakers patched canvas. The cook, working in the galley, had to prepare meals for hundreds using limited tools: a few cauldrons, a brick stove, and wooden utensils. Meals were simple: salted beef, hardtack, peas, oatmeal, and occasional cheese. Water was stored in casks that often turned stale, so beer or grog, rum diluted with water, became staples of the diet. One of the most important but unglamorous systems aboard Victory was the bilge. This was the lowest part of the ship, where seawater, spilled liquids, and waste accumulated. To prevent flooding and stagnant rot, Sailors had to pump the bilge regularly, a task that required hours of manual effort at the ship's pumps. The bilge water had a pungent, overwhelming smell. The phrase "in the bilge" became a saying for anything unpleasant or undesirable. Another essential but largely invisible detail was the ship's ventilation, or rather, the lack of it. In warm weather, below-deck temperatures could rise significantly, and the air could grow stale. Ventilation was achieved through open hatches, windsails, canvas funnels that caught breezes and directed them below, and occasional breaks in the routine when the crew could air out bedding and clothing. In poor weather, these makeshift systems failed, and the crew endured the heat, humidity, and odor. The gun decks, even during peace, formed one of the ship's central spaces. Each gun was operated by a team of sailors who knew their assigned positions intimately. Although the cannons often sat idle for months or years between battles, the crews practiced regularly. The guns had names, often cut into small plaques, and some were treated with superstitious reverence. The quiet maintenance of these weapons, oiling, cleaning, polishing, and checking gear, was part of the daily rhythm of ship life. Discipline aboard Victory followed strict naval regulations. Punishments included extra duties, reduced rations, or in severe cases, flogging. However, it is important to remember that discipline was not merely about control. On a vessel where teamwork was essential and danger was constant, order preserved lives. The slightest mistake in managing sails or rigging during a storm could send men plunging to their deaths or capsize the ship. The routines, therefore, existed not to suppress individuality but to protect the collective. The officers lived in more comfortable quarters, though comfortable is a relative term. The captain's cabin at the stern was spacious compared to the rest of the ship. Its large windows offered light and views of the sea. But even this space was temporary. In battle, the furniture was removed and the cabin became an extension of the gun deck. Canvas screens replaced walls. Privacy disappeared. The ship transformed from a living space into a machine of war within minutes. One often forgotten detail of life on an 18th century warship is the constant maintenance required to keep the hull seaworthy. The ship's bottom was copper-sheathed to protect against shipworm and fouling, but even so, barnacles and algae accumulated over time. Careening, the process of cleaning the hull by tilting the ship on its side, was laborious and required safe harbors. The boredoms of scraping, scrubbing, and repairing the ship's underside were as essential to its survival as any battle tactics. As you examine these countless small components, you start to understand that Victory's grandeur did not arise from dramatic moments, but from the persistence of details. A ship of this size thrived on repetition. Hoisting sails, cleaning decks, practicing drills, repairing lines, swabbing gun barrels, tending to stores, recording inventories, treating minor injuries, and navigating thousands of miles of open ocean with nothing but charts, sextants, and the trained eyes of officers. And yet, as you stand here, in your imagination, observing the quiet order of an ordinary day, you may begin to wonder something. For all its complexity, for all the labor invested into its rigging, hull, and daily routine, what was the one factor aboard HMS Victory that sailors considered most vital to survival? Was it the strength of the timber, the discipline of the men, the captain's leadership, or something subtler, almost hidden, threading silently through every deck and cabin? That question, unresolved for the moment, lingers as the ship gently rocks on the afternoon sea. You return to the imagined deck of HMS Victory, still hearing the steady groan of timber as the ship adjusts to the endless movement of the sea. The question from the end of the previous section remains with you. What was the most vital element aboard this great wooden world? It lingers like the faint smell of tar that hangs in every corner of the ship. But before any answer can be reached, you must travel deeper inside the layers of structure and routine that made life at sea possible. For only by examining all parts of the ship can you hope to understand which one held everything together. If the upper decks were the ship's skin and bones, then the lower ones were its beating heart, quiet, hidden, and indispensable. As you descend down the ladder from the upper gun deck into the dimmer spaces below, the smell shifts perceptibly. The scent of open air gives way to a heavier blend of wood polish, stale rations, old canvas, and human presence. Lanterns set into protective cages flicker faintly, casting long shadows across the beams. You arrive at the middle gun deck, where the cannon muzzles sit neatly aligned like silent guardians. Even in peacetime, this deck was a workspace. Sailors moved through it regularly to perform drills, polish the gun carriages, and ensure that every rope, tackle, and sponge was ready for instant use. The guns themselves were not merely weapons. They were part of the ship's identity. Their size and number determined Victory's classification as a first-rate ship of the line. On an average day, crews of men were assigned to each gun. Their tasks were repetitive but vital. Clean the iron with oil, check the wheels for cracks, inspect the britching rope that prevented recoil from injuring crew members. All this maintenance might seem mundane, even monotonous, but in the tightly structured world of the Royal Navy, boredom was safety. A gun that misfired or rolled unpredictably could kill men faster than any enemy shot. Moving aft on this deck, you reach the wardroom, the space where the commissioned officers took their meals. Compared to the cramped chaos of the lower decks, the wardroom appears almost civilized. Here, the officers sat at a long table, perhaps with a white cloth draped across it during calm weather, eating meals of slightly better quality than those provided to the common sailors. Brass candlesticks glowed on special occasions. The officers discussed navigation, duties, ship conditions, or news brought aboard by passing vessels. Social rank structured every conversation. Even the arrangement of seats around the table followed naval hierarchy. Beyond the wardroom lay the officers' sleeping cabins, small compartments with wooden bulkheads, a narrow bed, a chest for clothing, and perhaps a few personal items were all that could fit. The bulkheads were designed to be removable. During battle, the partitions would be dismantled to clear space for gun crews. Privacy, then, was an illusion of peace, not a permanent feature. Farther aft still was a place few lower-deck sailors ever saw, the captain's cabin. It occupied the entire width of the stern. Large windows, luxuries rare on ships, let in natural light. Charts, instruments, and the captain's writing desk stood near the center. The captain's furniture could include chairs, cupboards, and a bed with curtains. But even this refined space had a dual nature. In war, all of it was cleared away so the space could become an extended command center or additional gun position. Leaving the middle deck behind, you continue downward, stepping into the lower gun deck. This space was darker, quieter, and noticeably more claustrophobic. The deck beams were so low that some sailors had to stoop when walking. The cannons here were larger, the heaviest guns on the ship, and their great weight affected everything from the ship's balance to how the hull groaned in heavy seas. During long voyages, this deck often doubled as additional sleeping space when the upper decks became too crowded. Hammocks swayed between hooks attached to beams. In the still air, the fabric barely stirred. Imagine 200 men lined in close rows, breathing the same air, each hammock suspended just inches from the next. The naval routine allowed little room for personal belongings. A sailor's hammock rolled tightly into a small bundle when not in use, then stored in nettings on the upper deck. Everything had its place, and everything had a regulation. Now, descending again, you reach the orlop deck, a space where the wooden ribs of the ship curve like the inside of a rib cage. Light here is dim, and the air is noticeably cooler. The beams are lower still. This was not a place for comfort. It was a functional zone reserved for essential but largely invisible work. Here you find the purser's domain, where ledgers of pay, rations, and supplies were stored. The purser was responsible for issuing food and managing provisions, though the position was notorious for opportunities to profit through minor corruptions, underweighing rations, inflating records, or substituting cheaper products. Yet even with these issues, the purser was indispensable. A poorly managed ration system could lead to shortages, illness, and unrest. Nearby lies the sail room, where spare canvas was kept. Sails, neatly rolled or folded, lay in stacks like thick pieces of fabric armor. Every sail had an expected lifespan. Sometimes only months of heavy weather could wear them thin. The sailmaker's job was continuous, patching tears, reinforcing edges, or sewing entirely new sails when the old ones became too frayed to hold wind. Threads, needles, and waxed cords were as crucial to the ship as iron and gunpowder. Past the sail room, you find the sick bay, also called the cockpit. During voyages, this was the domain of the ship's surgeon. The space was small and contained little besides a table, instruments, and cloths. In battle, however, this dimly lit corner turned into a grim theater. Surgeons worked with saws, scalpels, and cauterizing irons, doing what they could with the limited medical knowledge of the time. But on ordinary days, the surgeon's duties were much quieter, caring for minor cuts, treating infections, and ensuring that the cramped, humid environment did not cause outbreaks of illness. Vinegar washes, routine inspections, and quarantining sick sailors were all part of medical discipline. Finally, you arrive at the very bottom, the hold. If the decks above were the ship's lungs and muscles, the hold was its digestive system. It contained massive wooden casks of food, salt beef, salted pork, flour, dried peas, oatmeal. Barrels of water, beer, and rum lined the space like a forest of rounded wood. Powder stores were kept in reinforced magazines, where open flames were strictly forbidden. The magazine keeper worked by lanterns enclosed in double glass and water-filled compartments to prevent sparks. Walking through the hold, you sense the immense weight of everything stored here. A fully loaded ship like Victory might carry months of provisions. The distribution of this weight was an art in itself. Poorly balanced storage could make the ship unstable. A shift in heavy casks during a storm could send the vessel listing. And because food and water rotted or spoiled over time, the crew had to rotate casks and monitor conditions constantly. The routine never ended. Even in silence, the ship demanded attention. But perhaps the most overlooked component of all lay beneath your feet, the keel and the bilge. Here, where the ship's lowest beams met the curve of the hull, water collected. The bilge pumps were crucial. They removed seawater that seeped through the planks and joints. Sailors took shifts at the pumps, sometimes for hours. The rhythmic clanking of pump handles was a sound heard across the ship, day and night. Without working pumps, even a minor leak could prove fatal. Now that you've explored the structure, consider the daily rhythms guiding Victory's crew. The ship followed a strict schedule divided into watches, 4-hour shifts that rotated through day and night. Each watch had responsibilities: trimming sails, keeping lookout, adjusting rigging, and monitoring the ship's course. Bells marked time. The sound traveled through the ship like a slow heartbeat, dividing the day into predictable intervals. At dawn, hammocks were rolled and stowed. Decks were scrubbed with holy stones, blocks of sandstone that wore down the wood gradually, keeping it smooth and clean. Scrubbing was a daily ritual, so ingrained that sailors performed it with minimal thought. The purpose was not only hygiene but discipline. A clean deck prevented disease and reduced the risk of fires, which were an ever-present danger. Breakfast followed. It was rarely satisfying. Hardtack and perhaps a spoonful of porridge. Hardtack, a dense biscuit made from flour and water, was tough enough to last months without spoiling. Sailors soaked it in liquid to soften it, sometimes discovering insects embedded inside. Complaints were common, but complaints did not change the menu. After breakfast came duties, sail checks, gun maintenance, rope splicing, gear inspection. Officers oversaw training drills. New recruits learned knots, climbing techniques, and how to handle weapons. Marines practiced formations on the quarterdeck. The bosun and his mates supervised work on rigging and sails. At midday, officers used sextants and compasses to determine the ship's position. This routine, though dull to observers, was essential. The margins of error were small. A miscalculation could send the ship miles off course, wasting weeks of travel or placing the vessel in dangerous waters. Dinner, often salted beef or pork, was served in the early afternoon. The food was salty, tough, and monotonous. Occasionally, if fresh provisions were available, meals included vegetables or fish. But on long voyages, surprises were rare. The evening passed in similar routines. As daylight faded, lanterns were lit. Men prepared their hammocks. The sounds quieted. The ship's officers continued navigating. The watch changed again. And through all of this, the question from earlier begins to sharpen. Now that you have seen the layers of structure, the decks, the people, the routines, you begin to grasp how interconnected everything was. But which of these mattered most? What single factor aboard HMS Victory held everything together, ensuring survival through storms, battles, and months at sea. Was it discipline, the ship's physical design, the officers' leadership, or something else entirely? Something that existed not in wood or rope, but in the collective behavior of the crew? That question lingers quietly, waiting for the next section. When you return once more to the decks of HMS Victory, the ship feels different, not because anything has changed physically, but because your understanding of it has deepened. Now you know how the beams curve, how the decks stack like layers of a wooden universe, and how every task, every rope, every lantern, and every piece of equipment fits into a broader structure. You feel as though you could walk the ship blindfolded and still know where you are from the subtle shift in scent or the creak of a particular beam. And yet the central question still waits. What was the most vital factor aboard this ship? What ensured its survival more than anything else? Today, as you walk across the quarterdeck in your imagination, the answer feels closer. Something woven not into the materials of the ship itself, but into the human threads that kept it alive. But before that answer reveals itself, the story of Victory's daily functioning must reach its final layer. The human routines and relationships that sustained life at sea. The ship was a floating society with its own culture, expectations, and unwritten codes. The officers came from different social backgrounds than the common sailors. Most officers were educated, trained from their youth, and often had family connections in naval circles. Sailors, however, came from ports, farms, fishing villages, and city slums. Some volunteered, others were pressed into service. Yet once aboard, rank mattered less than the shared dependence on one another. Consider the bosun's mates. They wielded authority over rope work and deck labor, enforcing discipline with calls of the whistle. Their voices carried across the ship, guiding men to stations, signaling changes in sails, and directing the rhythm of daily work. Despite their stern reputations, bosun's mates were deeply respected. They kept chaos at bay. They knew every inch of rope aboard, a monumental task considering the miles of rigging, each with its own name, purpose, and set of expected behaviors. Farther forward, the master, one of the highest-ranking officers, oversaw navigation, charts, and weather observations. The master was not a gentleman officer. He came from the professional seafaring class, often rising through decades of experience. His skill could mean the difference between arriving safely at a destination or running aground on unseen shoals. Then there were the lieutenants, each with their assigned watch. They supervised the running of the ship during their 4-hour blocks, ensuring that the course was true, the sailors vigilant, and the sails properly trimmed. The first lieutenant, acting almost as the ship's executive officer, was responsible for the discipline, safety, and organization of the entire crew. His presence shaped the mood of the ship as strongly as weather shaped the sea. And then, at the top, stood the captain. Captains varied widely, some benevolent, others harsh, still others methodical and distant. The captain's character radiated through every deck. A calm captain encouraged steady order. A volatile captain spread tension like static in the air. But even the greatest captain depended on the smooth cooperation of officers and crew. A warship was too complex to be governed by a single will. It required coordinated minds. Below decks, the human story played out differently. Sailors formed mess groups, small dining units that worked, ate, and often slept near each other. These groups became surrogate families. Within them, men shared rations, repaired clothing, swapped stories, and offered comfort in sickness. A mess group could profoundly affect a sailor's morale. If a member was injured or fell ill, the others tended to him as best they could. Games filled the scarce leisure moments. Dice, carved bone tokens, and simple cards made from scrap paper offered small escape. Men carved intricate shapes from wood or bone. Whistles, spoons, needles, and small figurines. Some learned new skills, like sewing or knot tying, taught by fellow crew members. These quiet acts of creativity flourished even in the tightest confines. In music, there was always music. Fiddles, flutes, and drums appeared during calmer evenings. Sailors sang shanties. Though aboard naval ships, shanties were structured differently than the work songs of merchant vessels. The Navy had stricter discipline, and songs helped pace labor rather than encourage it. Still, tunes drifted across the lower decks, lifting spirits. On rare occasions, if a captain encouraged it, a small dance might even break out on the weathered deck. All these small cultural threads tied the crew together. Yet life was not without conflict. Sailors argued over hammocks, rations, or duties. Homesickness gnawed at them. Long voyages tested tempers. But even disputes played a role in maintaining a sense of normalcy. A ship was not a monastery. It was a living community, with all the friction and affection that entailed. As you walk aft, toward the captain's great cabin, another layer of the ship's operation becomes clear: the role of written record. HMS Victory, like all naval ships, lived by the pen as much as by the sword. Logs were updated daily, sometimes hourly, noting wind direction, sail configuration, course, speed, encounters, repairs, punishments, rations issued, and medical cases. These entries seemed dull by modern standards, but they functioned like the memory of the ship. Without them, no voyage could be traced, no decision justified, and no event properly understood. From these logs, historians later pieced together the ship's life: storms weathered, miles traveled, ports visited. Many of the entries include nothing remarkable, just wind changes, minor repairs, or routine activities. But those quiet pages reveal the reality of maritime life far more clearly than any dramatic battle account. They show the work, the patience, the discipline, and the small, persistent efforts that carried the ship across oceans. Now you walk again toward the center of the ship, feeling the shift of the deck beneath your feet as though guided by the heartbeat of the sea itself. You hear the distant clatter of dishes from the galley. Nearby, a group of Marines in red coats stands quietly, waiting for their next instruction. A young sailor, perhaps no more than 16, coils a rope with careful precision, learning the muscle memory he will rely on in storms or battles. This is the final layer of Victory's daily life, experience. Not the intense drama of conflict, but the slow accumulation of practical knowledge. Experience taught sailors how to feel a shift in wind by the brush of air on their cheeks. It taught them which deck beam creaked in bad weather, which rope tended to fray, which cask needed rotating, which lantern needed trimming. Experience, and the sharing of it between generations of sailors, was the invisible force guiding the ship. And now, with all these layers laid before you, the central question rises again. What was the most vital factor aboard the ship? What ensured its survival more than anything else? You realize now there are many contenders. The strength of the oak hull, the precision of the rigging, the discipline enforced through watches, the leadership from the officers, the navigation mastered by the master, the medical care from the surgeon, the logs and records that tracked the ship's life, the routines that structured every day, the supplies that kept hunger at bay, the pumps that kept the bilge from flooding, the sails that caught the wind. But none of these, standing alone, fully answers the question. The true answer begins to take shape only when you step back and view the ship as a single living system. Every component, every job, every rank, every routine mattered, but they mattered because they worked together. The ship did not survive through strength or discipline or leadership alone. It survived through coordination, through the shared understanding that each person, each tool, each action served a common purpose. On a warship like Victory, survival depended on the ability of hundreds of individuals to act as one. If even one part failed, if the rigging snapped without repair, if the officers lost trust, if the crew refused discipline, if the surgeon neglected sanitation, if the purser mismanaged supplies, if the pumps were ignored, then the entire ship was endangered. This shared sense of interdependence, quiet but profound, formed the true lifeblood of the ship. It was not written in logs or ordered by officers. It emerged through daily work, through routine, through habit, through unspoken acknowledgement of danger. Sailors did not need to articulate it. They simply lived it. And so, the answer arrives. The most vital factor aboard HMS Victory was not wood, nor rope, nor leadership. It was cooperation, steady, practiced, often boring cooperation. A collective discipline that made the ship more than the sum of its parts. As you stand again at the rail, gazing out over the imagined gray sea, this insight settles gently. Victory was a masterpiece of engineering, but more importantly, it was a masterpiece of human coordination. Its legacy did not rest solely in its famous battles, but in the quiet, continuous work that kept it afloat in the first place. This realization extends beyond the ship. So much of history, far from the dramatic stories often told, was shaped by ordinary people doing ordinary tasks with steady persistence. Behind every grand event lies 1,000 small actions, practiced daily, unseen, but essential. And perhaps, as you let this thought drift through your mind like the slow roll of the waves, another question emerges. If cooperation was the hidden force that sustained HMS Victory, what equally quiet, often unseen forces shaped the structures we depend on today? The reflection lingers like the evening breeze over the sea, soft and unresolved. Even after understanding the immense network of cooperation aboard HMS Victory, there remain quieter details, background currents that shaped the environment in which that cooperation existed. These subtle aspects, often overlooked even by those who study naval history, form the atmospheric layers of life at sea. The sensory world, the psychological world, the environmental world, and the long-term rhythms that define the voyage of a ship more than any individual day ever could. To complete the story of victory, you need to step once more into the ship's world, not simply to look at the mechanics or routines, but to sense how it felt to live aboard her for weeks, months, or even years. Imagine waking gently, not to an alarm, but to the ship's slow-motion sway. A hammock, stretched between hooks along a beam, was shaped like a shallow bowl. It rocked with the ship, absorbing some of the motion and preventing sailors from rolling onto the floor during rough seas. Rising from a hammock was an art form. The narrow strip of cloth demanded balance. Swing one leg outward too sharply, and you might flip. Move too slowly, and you might tangle the blanket around your feet. In darkness, lit only by a few enclosed lanterns, the sounds around you acted as your guide. The shuffle of other men, the groan of the hull, the sigh of wind filtering through hatches above. Walking through the decks required an instinctive feel for the low beams. Many sailors developed a strange habit. They tilted their heads slightly forward at all times, their bodies unconsciously adjusting to avoid collisions. New recruits often emerged with bruises until the ship taught them its rhythms. In the morning, the ship smelled of damp canvas, lingering grog, and wooden beams that had absorbed decades of sea air. There was a scent of tar, thick and slightly sweet, rising from the ropes and seams. Tar was essential. It repelled water, preserved fibers, and protected the hull. The tarred smell was so strongly associated with sailors that people on land could sometimes identify a naval man simply from the scent of his clothes. When sailors climbed to the weather deck at first light, the air felt different, cooler, fresher, tinged with salt. Gulls might whistle in the distance if land was near. If not, only the endless horizon greeted them, a wide gray-blue line between water and sky, shifting subtly with the movement of the ship. The deck boards, scrubbed daily, held a faint trace of moisture. They were smooth from years of holy stoning, the constant sanding that gradually wore the planks thinner. Scrubbing the deck in the early hours became almost a meditative act for many. Kneeling with the stone block pressed against the planks, sailors pushed in long, steady arcs. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, yet strangely predictable. You could hear it, the rhythmic scrape of stone against oak, dozens of men working in unison. The sound became part of the soundtrack of the ship. Below deck, life followed different acoustics. On the gun decks, footsteps echoed, voices softened as though absorbed by the thick wooden walls. The creak of gun tackles, the shift of casks during rough seas, the occasional burst of laughter from a mess group, all of it merged into a dull undercurrent. Sailors knew the ship by sound as much as by sight. A loose block in the rigging produced a distinctive knock. A frayed rope produced a different creak. Men who spent years aboard could identify problems by ear in an instant. The emotional world of the ship was just as layered. Sailors lived in crowded conditions, far from home, with little privacy. Letters from land arrived infrequently. Messages from family could take months to reach them. In this environment, small rituals mattered deeply. The careful folding of a hammock, the carving of a wooden token, the arrangement of tin cups before meals. These rituals created stability in a life ruled by unpredictable seas. Even simple objects carried emotional weight. A sailor's sea chest, for example, held everything he owned. The chest might contain a change of clothes, a set of tools, a comb, perhaps a small keepsake from home. The chest doubled as a seat, a table, and sometimes even a writing surface. It was one of the few possessions that remained consistently in a sailor's life, no matter where the ship traveled. Beyond these personal spaces lay the communal rituals that forged cohesion. One example was the issuing of grog, the daily ration of rum diluted with water. Grog was not simply a drink. It was a moment of shared experience. Men gathered in small groups, ladling their portion from buckets and exchanging casual conversation before returning to duty. Rum, in some ways, functioned like a psychological anchor, marking time in a world otherwise governed by bells and watches. Another ritual was the airing of hammocks. On dry days, sailors took their hammocks to the weather deck and hung them along the railings. This allowed the cloth to dry and reduced the risk of lice or mold. The sight of dozens of hammocks flapping in the wind like pale flags became a familiar morning scene. Then there were the environmental challenges, storms, calms, and the vast nothingness that defined much of the open ocean. Storms were loud and chaotic. The ship groaned under strain. Water cascaded across the deck. Sailors climbed into the rigging despite the danger, clinging to rope and wood as wind lashed their faces. Commands were shouted and often lost in the roar. Yet after the storm passed, the ocean would sometimes fall into absolute stillness, a mirror-like calm where the ship barely moved. Calm seas brought their own discomforts. Sails hung slack. The ship drifted aimlessly. Heat built below deck, making the air thick and oppressive. Without strong winds to circulate air through windsails and hatches, the lower decks became stifling. Food spoiled faster. Tensions rose. Men grew irritable. And still, they endured. Months at sea eroded the sense of time. Days blended into one another. Because watches rotated, sailors rarely slept at the same hours from one week to the next. Some men wrote journals to keep track of time. Others counted significant days only by rare events, a sighting of land, a change of course, or the arrival of new provisions. Despite these hardships, many sailors felt a deep attachment to their ship. Victory, like any great vessel, developed its own personality. Wood warped in specific patterns. Decks had particular sounds. Certain ladders creaked at predictable moments. The ship was more than timber and canvas. It was the place where they lived, worked, laughed, suffered, and survived. It was a constant companion. And then, of course, there were the duties of maintenance that never ended. The tarred rigging had to be periodically untarred, cleaned, and retarred. What had to be scraped, polished, or repaired. Loose caulking was replaced. Ropes were spliced. Bulwarks repainted. The ship ate labor as steadily as the crew ate their rations. This continuous maintenance created a sense of purpose that filled even the most uneventful days. There was always something that needed doing. Always a line to check, a sail to inspect, a deck to clean, a cask to rotate. Monotony was not the absence of activity, but the presence of endless, predictable tasks. And here, finally, you return to the central idea of cooperation. It wasn't merely that the ship needed coordination. It was that every part of life aboard Victory reinforced the necessity of cooperation. The environment demanded it. The tasks required it. The routines taught it. Even the physical design of the ship encouraged cooperation. Narrow passages forced men to move around each other with patience. Shared mess groups encouraged social bonds. Hammocks hung in identical rows emphasized equality among the common sailors. Navigation, rigging, and gunnery demanded teamwork. In almost every detail, large or small, the ship made cooperation not just useful, but unavoidable. This brings the story to its final reflection. You have walked through the ship's layers. You have witnessed the routines. You have understood the psychological landscape. You have seen how hundreds of individuals, each with their own thoughts and worries, move together as one. But now, as you stand once more at the rail in your imagination, watching the endless sweep of ocean pass beneath the hull, a broader question emerges. HMS Victory was a machine of war, yes, but in daily life. It was a machine of survival, powered by ordinary humans doing ordinary tasks with extraordinary reliability. It floated across oceans not because it was strong, but because people worked together every day in countless small ways. And so you might wonder, if cooperation was the invisible force that kept Victory alive, what invisible forces keep our own modern structures, cities, systems, technologies functioning today? What quiet, unseen habits support the great machinery of our world?